This video will discuss how Poland could have assisted Ukraine in forming an independent state in 1919 while reaching a compromise with the Ukrainian side. Joseph Piłsudski understood well that the absence of an independent Ukraine would leave Poland's eastern border under constant threat. So what would have happened if Poland had supported Ukraine in this endeavor? How would this have changed the course of World War II? And most importantly, would Poland be divided now? I must warn that this video may provoke many disputes. I had already made a short video on this topic some time ago and faced accusations of spreading propaganda supporting Vladimir Putin, as well as Ukrainian propaganda and even Polish nationalism. In simpler terms, I was accused of supporting Putin while spreading Ukrainian propaganda. Sounds logical, doesn't it? Another problem you will face in this scenario concerns the city of Lviv. Some claim that its population was predominantly Polish, while others insist it was Ukrainian. As can be seen, there are already 171 responses under this comment, and people are engaged in a real battle in the comments. Lviv resembles Macedonia. Everyone possessed it at some point, and all have conflicting claims to this territory, making it a very disputed region. I will intentionally ignore many realities to make the script work better, so keep that in mind. Poles, who had been under foreign oppression for 123 years, sought to restore their country to the borders that existed before the partitions. That is, within the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the first partition. However, in the era of peak nationalism, this was practically impossible, as even Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians did not have their own country for a long time to govern according to their ideals. In simpler terms, other nationalities of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth now sought independence rather than just unification with Poland. The restoration of the Commonwealth to its former borders was quite an unpopular idea in Poland itself. The Versailles Treaty could determine Poland's western border, but the eastern question remained open. Some politicians, like Joseph Piłsudski, sought to create a federation and take as much eastern land as possible. Roman Dmowski wanted to create a more compact Poland, consisting mainly of Polish territories or regions where Poles could easily become the majority. To explore this alternative history, we need to imagine that Roman Dmowski became a prominent Polish politician instead of Józef Piłsudski, which would have been a significant change for the Polish nation. Dmowski's rise to power did not seem impossible, as the People's Union was the most popular political party in Poland in 1919. This alliance opposed Piłsudski and supported Dmowski, and if they had gained a majority of seats, it could have radically changed the political situation in the country. The direction in which Poland could develop would imply that it would prefer to become more ethnically homogeneous to avoid claiming significant Ukrainian and Belarusian territories. This topic is quite controversial, as some argue that Ukrainians did not exist until 1991, and that Ukraine could not form a separate nation because there was no clear Ukrainian identity in 1919. However, according to the video plot, Ukraine is to become independent, regardless of people's opinions. Historically, in 1919, Ukraine and Poland had many conflicting interests. The main problem was that, like in Hungary, where there were many German enclaves, in Poland there were also areas with a Polish majority, including the city of Lviv, which was almost surrounded by Ukrainian villages. Poland wanted to reclaim these lands at any cost, which worsened their relations with potential Ukrainian allies, as Ukraine also claimed this territory, and dividing it otherwise would leave one side dissatisfied. The Poles had been at least a little willing to set aside their pride and temporarily hand over Lviv to the West Ukrainian People's Republic. The Polish-Ukrainian alliance could have been much more effective for several reasons. Lviv was the main reason why Poland and Ukraine could not work together. This city was considered the most Polish at the time. While Warsaw and other major Polish cities were Russified until the fall of the Russian Empire, Lviv remained virtually untouched, and Polish culture flourished there. Despite Lviv having a Polish majority, there were more Ukrainians in the province, creating an obvious problem for both countries vying for Lviv. In fact, Lviv was chosen as the capital of the West Ukrainian People's Republic, and Poland wanted to seize it. This led to the Polish-Ukrainian War, which I would like to prevent in this alternate history, so both countries could work together against a common enemy, the Soviet Union. Poland and Ukraine were also quite diverse and differed from each other. Poland was divided between Austria, Germany, and Russia, while Ukraine was mainly divided between Russia and parts of Austria. It can be imagined that these large empires dominated their subjects for centuries, so the German and Austrian parts of Poland were more developed compared to the Russians. For example, Eastern Galicia, ruled by the Habsburgs, was somewhat more developed than the rest of Ukraine, which, to put it mildly, remained practically in the Middle Ages. In this alternative history, with a compromise between Poland and Western Ukraine regarding the transfer of control over Lviv, we eliminated one of the factors that led to the loss of Ukrainian independence. But it came at a great cost to realism. It can be asserted that Poland sought to restore its territories. Suppose that before the partition, the border between Poland and Western Ukraine could have been established if the Poles had agreed to give up everything east of the Vistula River. The conflict of interest between the two sides manifests in their unwillingness to make concessions. The cooperation between Poles and Ukrainians in the year 1900 seems more unrealistic than one might think. But what if they decided to unite after all? In 1919, Poland faced not only Ukraine, but also Czechoslovakia. Simply put, it is about the region of Zozia, inhabited by Poles since the 10th century, which belonged to the Kingdom of Bohemia for over 500 years. Disputes continue between the Czechs and Polish nationalists, so please show politeness in comments. If the Polish government, in the presence of American diplomats, had agreed to the division of the disputed territory, as happened in our history after the Polish-Czechoslovak War, this disgraceful 7-day conflict between two Slavic nations could have been avoided. I assume that Zosia could have been divided along ethnic lines, as happened in our history. But the war between Poland and Czechoslovakia would have been prevented. Perhaps the local coal power plant would be in Poland, but would continue to supply electricity to Czech households, while the railway connecting Moravia to Slovakia and passing through Polish Zosia would remain under Czech control. This is important as Czechoslovakia and Poland would historically become enemies. As mentioned earlier, in 1919, the Polish-Czechoslovak War occurred, during which Czechoslovakia annexed Zosia, greatly angering Poland. If you ever wondered why Poland did not help Czechoslovakia when it was divided by Germany, here is the reason. Poland managed to bring Zosia back in 1938, when Czechoslovakia lost the Sudetenland. This small region hindered Poland and Czechoslovakia from working together, allowing both to be occupied by Germany and later become Soviet satellites. In any case, by eliminating this fatal factor, one could attempt to push the Bolsheviks to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, as Poland would not be distracted by a brief war with Czechoslovakia. Moreover, Poland and Czechoslovakia could even become allies in the conflict with the Soviet Union, as the famous Czechoslovak Legion fought against the Bolsheviks. Czechoslovakia could support Poland if the conflict was resolved diplomatically. I do not claim that it would have been possible to push the Bolsheviks all the way to Rostov without allowing the Russians to reclaim eastern Ukraine. My viewers certainly know that the Polish army entered Kiev in May 1920, but a few months later, the Red Army besieged Warsaw. Moreover, as I mentioned, there were huge cultural, social, and ideological differences between Western Ukraine and Poland. Eastern Ukraine, unlike the Western Center, which was predominantly Christian and capitalist-oriented, was under the control of anarchists. In Eastern Ukraine, there existed a state called Mohu, resembling an anarchic society where money and police were abolished, representing a classless and stateless community. Some researchers claim that the Ukrainian common identity had not yet formed in the year 1900, making this video quite contentious depending on the perspective. If the Polish-Ukrainian alliance could start expanding to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, Vladimir Lenin would likely not have ceased his cooperation with Neremno, and the anarchists in Ukraine, along with the communists in Russia, would have continued their struggle. Ultimately, after months of fighting, a peace treaty would be signed in which Soviet Russia would recognize the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic, consisting of eastern Galicia and central Ukraine west of the Dnieper River, including Kiev, which would be right on the border with Russia. The independence of Belarus would also be recognized, although it would become an economic protectorate of Poland and Ukraine. As for the city of Lviv, it would be under the control of Ukraine and would likely remain the capital of the Ukrainian Federal Republic. Kiev would make no sense as a capital since it was on the border with Russia, while Odessa would be close to Romania, just 40 kilometers away. At that time, there were no other suitable cities for the capital of Ukraine, so Lviv would have to become the capital, and Poland would have to somehow accept this, which, in my opinion, is unlikely. Perhaps Poland would do this to win over Ukraine and then effectively annex it, which was indeed the Poles' plan. Historically, Poland attempted to restore its pre-war borders by trying to install a Polish minister who would vote for unification with Poland. In 1921, two military factions are formed: Intermarium, including Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, and Lantant, consisting of Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. However, initially these factions were to resolve territorial disputes over southern Bessarabia, which now belongs to Ukraine, and was home to many Russians and Ukrainians who would have preferred to become part of Ukraine rather than Romania. However, due to concerns about the newly formed Soviet Union, there were no clashes or provocations between the two factions, and most of Central and Eastern Europe remained more or less stable. Czechoslovakia begins to transform into an industrial tiger. Poland, which is not obligated to govern Western Belarus and Eastern Galicia, shows economic growth, while the Ukrainian Federal Republic starts to develop due to the absence of conflicts. Now, Poland is more ethnically homogeneous, unlike our history, where a third of the population consisted of other ethnicities. The population of Poland consisted of minorities: Ukrainians, Jews, Belarusians, Lithuanians, and Germans. In 1906, power still belonged to Joseph Pilsudski, who could not revoke previous decisions granting autonomy to Ukraine. Then came the Great Depression, which, like thunder from a clear sky, began to damage most European economies, including the emerging ones. The Ukrainian Federal Republic would likely find itself in a similar economic situation as the Second Polish Republic in our history, and would certainly face mass unemployment. This would lead to the rise of ultra-nationalists led by Stepan Bandera, as well as a communist opposition that, despite the famine on the other side of the border, would continue to portray life in the Soviet Union as paradise. We can assume that among extremist parties in Ukraine, the Bandera supporters would be much more popular than the communists. Bandera, known in our history as the executioner of the Polish people during the German occupation, could have gathered many supporters in Ukraine due to his anti-Polish and anti-Romanian propaganda. Although the rise of Stepan Bandera to power may seem unlikely, one could assume that Poland would not have a favorable view of the Ukrainian state. After the election of Joseph Pilsudski, Poland would have adopted a more aggressive strategy towards Ukraine, meaning that any hopes for an alliance between the seas would be shattered. Poland could become ultra-nationalistic under such conditions due to the population composition, which was now dominated by Poles and Jews, as a result of the absence of Eastern Galicia and Western Belarus. Unlike our story, the Polish people would have had more influence in parliament, which would have facilitated the shift to ultra-nationalism, as Belarusians and Ukrainians would be armed within their borders. On the other hand, Ukraine, fearing a possible annexation of Eastern Galicia by the Polish army and the forceful capture of Lviv, began to seek closer cooperation with Lithuania, despite territorial disputes with neighboring Romania. With the rise to power of the man with a funny mustache, Czechoslovakia began to import Ukrainian minerals in exchange for modern machines, cranes, trucks, and later, even tanks and airplanes. After the assassination of Yugoslav King Alexander III by the pro-Bulgarian Macedonian, Lanzant loses his main initiator, and after the elections of 1935, Yugoslavia comes under the leadership of Milan Stanovic, who begins to drift away from Czechoslovakia. As for the Austrian artist, at this time he would invest in more nationalist propaganda among national minorities such as Germans, Hungarians, Croats, and pro-Bulgarian Macedonians. Germany, in turn, would try to undermine these states from within, fueling national sentiments and unhesitatingly investing in Ukrainian forces. Bandera, along with Benito Mussolini, whose ultra-nationalist ambitions could lead to an attack by Ukraine on Czechoslovakia, counted on Germany's support, which promised Ukraine the Carpathian Ruthenia in case of Czechoslovakia's destruction. Assuming that Ukraine has not yet become ultra-nationalistic and has a relatively functional parliament, it can be assumed that to prevent an ultra-nationalist power takeover, Ukrainian Social Democrats could create a popular front with communists, as was done in France. This could temporarily become an obstacle for Stepan Bandera. At this time, Ukraine found itself in a political deadlock. As for Romania, after the introduction of the royal dictatorship in late 1937 to early 1938, it began to isolate itself. The Slavic majority in southern Bessarabia demanded to join Ukraine. The reason this never happened in our history was that the Christian population of this region did not want to live under the Red Terror. However, now that democracy has been established in Ukraine, it has become very tempting for the southern Bessarabians to join